So, Teresa's going to begin our trip with an overview of some of the many UNESCO sites in various regions of France. Hold on to your hats for a whirlwind tour.
Thank you, Shelley. And I want to thank you for putting together our PowerPoint today. France has 44 UNESCO sites. Some of them are natural features like mountains and caves and reefs and lagoons. Some of them are buildings like churches and abbeys and forts and towers. Others are other man-made features like canals and vineyards and prehistoric dwellings built of sticks in the marshes. But all of them have exceptional cultural importance. I'll be showing where some of these sites are around France, and Shelley will show you a map of France each time. If you downloaded the map that came with your email from Kathy and Wendy, you can refer to that. Next, the Ile-de-France is the core of modern-day Paris and the heart of France. These sites are very familiar to all of us: Notre Dame, the Louvre. Next, the Eiffel Tower, the breathtaking Sainte-Chapelle Church, UNESCO symbol. Yes.
Okay, great. Let me go here. And here we go.
Well, this is obviously the Louvre from inside the pyramid, and Notre Dame. Next. This is, of course, the Eiffel Tower and the Sainte-Chapelle Church. They were doing some renovation, unfortunately, on the left side, so it messed up my picture. Next. This is the Pont Alexandre III, which crosses the Seine. This is a UNESCO site, and it's part of the Ile-de-France area. Next. The banks of the Seine themselves are considered UNESCO sites. Day and night, people are all over the place. Rick Steves calls them Paris's living room. Next. Now we go to Normandy, up in the northwest part of the country, to Mont Saint-Michel and the Bay of Mont Saint-Michel, where the average difference between high and low tides is 33 feet. Next. So there's Saint-Michel, obviously, and there's a tower near Cherbourg, also up in that area near Saint-Michel. It was built by Sébastien Vauban in the 1600s. Louis XIV commanded Vauban to build a ring of fortifications like this around France's borders. Next. Now we're in the Loire Valley. This practically bristles with UNESCO sites. There are historic towns, next, like Chinon and Blois, which are right on the Loire. They're each royal cities, and they were seats of the government in the Middle Ages. Next. Of course, there are many cathedrals. Chartres Cathedral has incredible stained glass windows, and in the summer evenings, it's illuminated at night with a light and sound show. And on the right is a Bourges, an ancient Gothic cathedral where Eleanor of Aquitaine was crowned in 1137. Next. Of course, the Loire is very famous for its chateau. This one is Villandry, which has amazing gardens, and you can only see about a fourth of them here. It's absolutely beautiful. Next. This is Chambord on the left. It's the largest of the chateaux on the Loire. It has 365 fireplaces. And Cheverny has been a hunting lodge since the 1600s. A family built it. They still live there. It maintains a kennel of 75 hunting dogs, and you can see them being fed if you go there during the daytime. Next. Now we're in Burgundy on the eastern side of the country. Next. This is near the city of Bonn, which is at the southern end of the Burgundy region. It's recognized for its terroir and for its vineyards, and they're great tasting caves open to the public. These are a lot of fun if you can get there. Next. The great abbeys of Vézelay are in Burgundy. On the left, the great abbeys are there. Vézelay is on the left. 3 crusades were launched from this one. And on the right is the Abbey of Fontenay, where medieval monks forged iron into farming tools and made technological advances in ironworking using water power in the early Middle Ages. Next. South Central France in the Languedoc-Roussillon area. The canal, next. The Canal du Midi is 155 miles long. It was dug in the 1600s and provided a shipping route from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. It now has only 65 locks, but it's used for pleasure boating. Next. Also in Languedoc-Roussillon, of course, is the walled city of Carcassonne and the Fortress Cathedral of Albi. And the building next to the cathedral houses the Museum of Native Son Toulouse-Lautrec. Next. We're in the Pyrenees mountain chain. Next. This is culturally and historically important to both France and Spain. And in the chain of mountains is Mont Perdu with a Cirque de Gavarnie. It's a natural bowl carved by glaciers. Next. A path leads to the waterfall at the top of the Cirque. And there's the plaque certifying its UNESCO status. Next. This is a map of the Camino de Santiago routes that cross France. If you can see them, they're in blue, and they all seem to funnel down to a small town of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, which is noted there by an arrow. It's at the base of the Pyrenees before they cross into Spain. Next. If you saw the movie The Way with Martin Sheen, part of it was filmed at this bridge, which is the starting point of one of the major Camino routes across northern Spain. Next. The end point of all the pilgrimages is the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela at the northwest corner of Spain, itself another UNESCO site. And you see pilgrims resting there in the plaza before they enter the cathedral. Some of them were crying with emotion after finishing their pilgrimage. Next. Now we're in Alsace, which is an area between Germany and France that was passed back and forth for centuries. Next. This is the cathedral at Reims. That city has 3 buildings that qualify it for the UNESCO site. They have a cathedral and an abbey and a bishop's palace. Next. Joan of Arc fought for her champion, King Charles VII, and saw him crowned here at the Cathedral in Reims in 1429. And the coronation feast was held next door at the bishop's palace. Next. To end this whirlwind trip around UNESCO's sites in France, we go to the small village of Epernay in Alsace and its beautiful hillsides of grapes. This area is the only place in the world that can call its sparkling wine champagne. Next. The grave of Dom Pierre Perignon is in Epernay, and he is the monk who accidentally discovered how to make champagne by fermenting his wine a second time. Thank you very much. And next, Patty is going to talk about one of France's most beloved sites.
Versailles. Welcome to Versailles and the land of the Sun King. This is the sun god Apollo. The palace was the principal royal residence of France from 1682 to 1789. Next. Located 12 miles southwest of Paris, it's an exciting and popular tourist attraction. John and I were fortunate enough to have a 10-day stay in Paris, which allowed us to do some day trips. Thanks to some friends who gave us their apartment, we were there in July 2012. The train to Versailles is an easy way to get there. Tickets, of course, purchased ahead of time. It was a very hot day in July. Next. This is an aerial view of the grounds, which shows the 8-mile access area, all that greenery. That's the area of the palace, gardens, pools, and the Trianon domain, which are more chateaus. You can see the town of Versailles on the right, where all the houses are. Next. Louis XIV was responsible for the expansion of his palace residence, gardens, and Grand Trianon Palace. He was a true Renaissance man, even though he was born 100 years after Renaissance. He turned France into a global power. He made it the first centralized modern government. He changed the culture of the world. Everyone wanted to copy Versailles' qualities. High culture was exhibited. France was in vogue and everyone wanted to have the fashion, the culture, and the Baroque style. He started the Paris Opera and the ballet. He was very fond of dancers, and he gave them many privileges. As you know, all of our ballet steps are in French. So next. This is the public entrance for the tourists. You can see our line. You can see some women with umbrellas shading themselves from the hot sun. On the left, you can see the gold gate, which was all restored. It's gold leaf. Next, this is the royal courtyard entrance for dukes, barons, and the princes of the time. So again, beautifully decorated in the Baroque style with the gold. Next. Okay, Louis identified himself with the sun god Apollo and called himself the Sun King, the icon. Idleness, games, and the good life were encouraged among his guests and dignitaries, so that Louis could rule the country. He always considered himself the state. He was it. This gate here is actually very beautiful, gold leaf restored, and you can see the Sun King there up on top. Next. I will show these next few slides fairly quickly to save time. There were royal apartments, state apartments, and private rooms. This is the Queen's bedroom. Royalty were never alone. There was always someone in attendance or someone visiting, and they couldn't even deliver a baby without public observance. Next, King's bedroom, and the red theme is throughout the palace. Next room, the guest room. And the next room is an example of a dining room within the palace. The next room is the gold room, which shows just gives you an example of some of the artwork that's exhibited throughout the museum. I want to call it is a museum. It's a walk through history. There were rooms for gods. There were rooms for colors. There was a war room and a peace room. Next. The Hall of Mirrors is in the Grand Gallery, as well as the peace room and the war room. The mirrors were a rarity in this era, and the Grand Hall light reflected everywhere off the crystals. If there was a ball, all these candles would be lit, the crystals would be sparkling, the mirrors were reflecting, and it was just an amazing event with a lot of dizzy dancing. Next. The chapel, currently under restoration, it's supposed to open later in 21, was Louis' spiritual legacy. Again, the large windows allowing light to come in. Louis built the Hall of Mirrors and the chapel late in life. He used the same architect, and they are considered the two jewels of the palace. The chapel is a treasure of sacred architecture and a showpiece of the arts at the time. It evokes the principle of divine right monarchy, a reminder that the king's power is only temporal. And he did soften up a lot later in his years. Next. This is an example of a shoe art display in the Grand Gallery in 2012. It was an amazing display of pots and lids somehow put together for this piece of showpiece art, which you can see all over the internet as well. Next. The gardens. The gardens demonstrated the control of nature, and it took over 40 years to create them all. Each garden has its own theme: fountains, ponds, sculpture, and flowers. Everything is geometrically designed. He had 1,000 orange trees, which was very unusual in this cold climate. Next. Flowers next. A little further view. Next. Okay, the fountains. This is the chariot of Apollo, the sun carriage. The gilded lead. Apollo bursts forth from the water in anticipation of his daily flight above the earth. Next. There's a close-up of, again, Louis in the middle, Apollo in the middle, actually, and the horses rising up. It was just an incredible fountain. Next, the Latona Fountain. Latona, again, tribute to Apollo. She's the mother of Apollo and Diana, and they're shown next to her on the pedestal there. She's protecting her children from the peasants who are throwing insults and disallowing her to drink their water. She pleads with Jupiter, their father, and curses the peasants, turning them into frogs and lizards. Next. You can see them at various stages of metamorphosis there. And there's one lady there who hasn't turned into a frog yet, and they're still yelling at her, and they're mad at her as hell. Many have already turned. Next. This is the Grand Trianon Palace that Louis built for his first mistress. It was also a way to get away from all the busy hustle bustle of Versailles. You can notice the beautiful red marble, and that had to substitute for the blue porcelain he originally built this in. The porcelain crumbled within 2 years. Next. This is the Petit Trianon, sorry. This was Marie Antoinette's place. This came much later. Louis XV, 16th gave it to her. It's neoclassic design. We're far away from the Baroque, but it was a beautiful, again, further away place. Next. One of the rooms with a portrait there. Next. Marie Antoinette and her children. Next. The marble fireplace. Again. Next. The music room. Next. And there finally we have the beautiful Hamlet. Okay, this is John and I, when we got here, I mean, we walked all the way back there. It finally started to sprinkle some rain. You can see it's cloudy, and gosh, were we glad to cool off. It was one hot day. So we were in luck, and we visited this hamlet, which is a rustic retreat, which Marie Antoinette created. And the design was, the furnishings and design were far from rustic. Next. It had 12 cottages, and the buildings surrounding the lake even had a pool. I loved these flowers. The next, so I took a few shots of them. It was a working farm with a dairy and a windmill and animals. Many royals across Europe had this feature on their lands. Next. And finally, I just want to say, I hope you will be encouraged to revisit some of your favorite trips and share the experience with us. It was incredible how much I learned and how much research I did to create the various layers of this presentation. So kudos to all of you who are looking forward to doing this. I'm going to unmute and introduce Anne.
Actually, Shelley.
Okay.
So let's take another day trip from Paris to visit a very different, and shall I say humble, home and garden. We're on our way to Giverny, a small village 45 miles from Paris, and the location of the famous Impressionist artist Claude Monet's home and garden. Giverny and the gardens that inspired Monet are currently being proposed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And we feel optimistic that the committee will grant this well-deserved status, and I think you will too once we've visited. We'll take the metro, easily located in Paris by these ubiquitous metro signs, to the Gare Saint-Lazare railway station. And here's one of Monet's many paintings of the station, perhaps at midday by the looks of the sunlight pouring through the skylight onto the ground and also onto that buttery Parisian architecture in the background. But here's a contemporary look at the station from the exterior. Well, all aboard, let's take a seat for our train, on our train, for a 45-minute journey to the Gare de Vernon, the train station where we'll disembark and take a Giverny shuttle, or for the more adventurous, you can rent a bike across the street. But why don't we get a lay of the land here with this map of Giverny and the gardens, and we'll enter here. We'll take a look at all of the plants and the garden in the near the house. Then we'll go in to see Monet's home, and then toward the back, we'll exit and go into look at his famous Japanese-inspired garden. Well, here we see two of Monet's paintings of his garden. Giverny is located in the Seine Valley in Normandy, where the light is very soft and very luminous. And Monet was very much aware of the quality of this translucent light when he decided to rent and eventually purchase this home. Remember that Impressionism was all about capturing the effects of light outdoors, and it was the invention of tin tubes of paint that enabled Monet and his contemporaries to paint en plein air, in other words, outside. Here's a splendid photo that perfectly shows this exquisite light that I was describing. Well, Monet initially rented his cider farm with its apple orchards in 1883, eventually purchasing it in 1890 when he was able to realize his plans to build studios, replant the gardens, and literally construct that Japanese-inspired garden. In fact, the garden is seen as a work of art in its own right, and it was the sole subject of Monet's paintings for the last 20 years of his life. Monet replaced the fruit trees with flowers planted in beds and crowded squares, their blooming periods well synchronized. He preferred flowers in masses, recalling fields of Dutch tulips, and constantly renewed the plantings to change colors. Upon entering the Clos Normand, in other words in English, the enclosed Norman garden, you'll notice the formal arrangement of garden beds with long alley pathways in between, very much like an English garden. And although it's an organized setting, the beds are loose and informally planted in large swaths and patches of bright complementary colors. Here's the main arbor covered allée, overgrowing with nasturtiums. And here's the same area with Monet walking down the same path. Let's take a look at Le Pressoir, the affectionately named cider house in pink stucco and cheerful green shutters, where Monet lived with his family for 43 years. We're going to take a look at some of the rooms inside. Here's the little reading room, and it sits to the left of the entrance. This is the sitting area where Alice, Monet's second wife, read to her children at times. We can see that the room is painted in 2 tones of blue, except for that brick-colored ceramic floor that provides a stark contrast to the rest. Various Japanese prints decorate the wall. And for his first studio, just off the reading room, Monet converted a dirt-floored barn connected to the house. This was made into an unpretentious drawing room, furnished with rustic chairs. And notice that bust of Monet on the left that was created by Rodin. The walls were just crammed with Monet's unframed paintings, and you can see the room really hasn't changed. Here's the delightful dining room that accommodated Monet's large blended family. He had everything painted in 2 tones of yellow, one rather pale and the other a deeper yellow. The friends called it a Monet yellow. This vibrant color really enhances the blues of the dishes on display in the buffets. And the floor, I just love it. Really adds a sense of whimsy. Well, I don't know about you, but I always love to see the kitchen, and this one doesn't disappoint. Here we see a fireplace and tile walls decorated in blue ceramics fabricated in the city of Rouen. The blue creates a peaceful atmosphere that significantly contrasts with the lively yellow that we saw in the dining room. And in fact, Monet wanted a blue kitchen so that the guests would see the right color and harmony, just like an artist would, with the yellow dining room where the door to the kitchen was when the door to the kitchen was open. Well, now it's time to exit through those doors and head back to find Monet's prized Japanese-style water garden. Upon buying his property, he also purchased an adjacent lot on the other side of the railroad tracks that bordered his property, and he spent an entire decade with gardeners, transforming it into his Japanese-inspired garden with lily pond. As a collector of ukiyo-e prints, Monet was a dedicated Japanophile. He was intrigued by Japanese images of plants, water, bridges, and with the permission from the local government, He diverted a tributary of the Ept River, much to the consternation of his neighbors, to create this man-made pond. The artist installed his wooden Japanese style footbridge that aligned with the Grande Allée that we saw previously, that arbor-covered path leading to the main entrance of his home. The garden is planted in an Eastern style, a layout more natural in appearance, in contrast with the Western style Clos Normand garden with its geometric plots. It also contained many plants associated with the East, including bamboo and ginkgo, flowering Japanese crabapple, and Japanese plum trees. The water lily pond, though, was the most important feature of his garden. Here we see those fabulous weeping willows. Ensuring the crystalline quality of the water and the vibrancy of the lilies required one gardener to skim the pond's surface on a daily basis and dunk those lilies to remove the dust generated by a nearby road. The pond offered an ever-changing reflective surface that captured the color of the lilies, the foliage of the adjacent weeping willows, and at times the changing effects of the clouds, as we can see in one of his later paintings. Now, if you didn't get enough of Monet and you want to see all of his paintings, you can do so in Paris. I wanted to leave you with this photo of him in his beloved garden with a funny quote, "Beyond painting and gardening, I'm good for nothing." And here, of course, are the 3 museums where you can see so many of his paintings. Well, Anne is now going to take us south of Paris to see some very ancient sites. You need to unmute yourself, Anne.
Okay.
There you go.
Yes, okay, here we go. Okay. Back in the early 2000s, my husband did some work in France for his company and over several years. And we thought that was a great excuse for us to explore France. And so I would fly over to, I would meet him over there. I would fly from Baton Rouge to Atlanta to Paris and meet him there, and we would explore one part of France or another. Both of these areas that I'm going to talk about are in southern France. And if you look on your map, we're going to see prehistoric sites, decorated caves of the Mersey Valley, which had probably more caves, and our concept of the caveman came from that valley, and all the historic sites that have been found there. And then some of the Roman sites that we visited were in Provence. And these are all UNESCO sites. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're in the valley where the prehistoric people lived, and we are east of Bordeaux. Look on your map and find east of Bordeaux and north of Toulouse. You'll see Périgueux, and you'll see these other towns, Les Assises and Sarlat, and Lascaux are marked on there, and that's the area we're going to talk about. There are narrow valleys here and many caves. Now, if we went back to 10,000 to 40,000 years ago, the northernmost part of France would be covered by an ice sheet because it's the ice ages. But the rest of it was a good territory for hunter-gatherers to live in. And if there happened to be caves in that area, that's where the people like to gather. Both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens lived there. Next slide. Next slide. This is the village of Les Assises, which is in a narrow valley, and it has this big rock face all along the side. And you see how the buildings are built into the rock face. Well, the prehistoric people had the same thought, but this looked like a nice snug place for them to live, and they did. On the right, you see the Museum of Prehistory, which is there, and a statue of a Neanderthal man. And the museum is packed with artifacts that have been found in that area. Something like 175 sites, archaeological sites in that area, and 25 painted caves. Next slide. At one of the sites we visited, we saw this reproduction of a house, how the people, which they built against the rock face, a little wall, and then a thatched roof. And the Native Americans in Arizona, places like Canyon de Chelly, they also lived in similar circumstances. To the right, you see a cave that is just down the road from Les Aziz, and it's one of the very few that the public is allowed to enter anymore. And it has cave paintings in it. Next slide, please. These are some of the most artistic of the cave paintings that have been found. Lascaux is the name of the cave, which in 1940, some kids were playing and their dog fell in a hole, and then they had to get a ladder to get him out, and they discovered the cave was painted with pictures of animals. And they told their parents told the priest, and the priest told the professor, and pretty soon it was a great tourist area. And they made a big opening for the cave so that people could go in and see the paintings, which are considered to be much better quality even than other paintings that had been discovered previously. But all these people caused moisture to come in, and the paintings started to crumble, and moss was growing on them, and they were being destroyed. So in 1963, the cave was shut down. And after that time, a reproduction of the cave was built, also underground, but it's a reproduction of the two main rooms of the Lascaux cave, and it's called Lascaux 2. And that's what you're seeing here. And they reproduced all the cave paintings exactly the way they were in the original Lascaux cave. So the two bulls you see are part of the Hall of the Bulls, which is one of the rooms in the cave. But looking back at the bulls, because you can see paintings of other animals that look like deer. And that's one of the features of these caves, is that the people used them for years and years, and they would paint over the old paintings. So next slide. Okay, here's some more of the Lascaux cave, and they just are more realistic and really good compared to some of the other caves. I think they're especially good. And that's why the people were so impressed by them. And the one of these, the one picture shows a bison and what looks like a person, a little stick figure. And that stick figure is the only picture of a human in any of the caves. I think in the ones in Spain or France or any of them. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now we're in Provence, in the south of France, right on the Mediterranean. And look for Marseille on your map. And then a little to the northeast of that is Aix. My husband went to a meeting in Aix-en-Provence. I flew to Paris and to Marseille and met him, and we spent a few days in Provence, in Aix. And then we had a day or two when we could explore the rest of Provence. And we included some of these Roman sites in that visit. Next slide. Now we're in Arles, which is a modern city on the Rhone River, but it has wonderfully preserved artifacts there. And the first one is, it's called an amphitheater. I call it a Colosseum. It's been remodeled and restored many times over the last 2,000 years, and it's still being used. You can see on the inside, the old stone seats have crumbled away, but they put up some metal seats above those, and they use them for various events. And the day we were there, they were setting up for a rock concert, and those men in the foreground are doing a sound check. Next slide. Okay, outside of the big arena, there's also what we call a Greek theater. Of course, it's Roman, but it's also being used for modern events, and it has like a half circle of seats and a stage. And the original version had columns all the way around, And those two columns have been set up for us to see what it looked like. The sign that you can see there tells us that there were amphitheaters like we saw all over the Roman world and around the Mediterranean. And the one in Arles is about the same size as the one in Pompeii. Okay, next slide. And this is Pont de Gard, the bridge over the River Gard. And it's famous for its beauty and the 3 layers of arches, very strong architectural features that the Romans were specialists in that. The lower set of arches is the bridge, and you can still walk across it. It was a bridge that was big enough for people and horses and everything to go across. The upper part is a aqueduct, which brought water from one area to another. And it has a visitor center, trails you can walk on, and it was built shortly before the Christian era, and it's a technical and artistic masterpiece. And this is the end of our presentation.